This is Pod Strangely Warmed, a place where we tell the good Methodist story, where we have conversations that invite followers of Jesus to seek after that loving, just, and free world that God imagines for us all, and have a little fun along the way. Hi, and welcome to Pod Strangely Warmed. I'm Daniel Hawkins, your host, and as we come to the end of our time here in November, we're going to begin a conversation that's been happening across the Horizon Texas Conference for about a year and a half now. So long before we were officially a thing, beginning in September at the Uniting Conference, we've been having conversations across conferences about how can we care well for our communities, for our churches, for our neighborhoods during the holiday season. You may have heard of the concept of a Blue Christmas service before. It is a service intended to help meet people in a season that can sometimes be characterized by grief, by loss, by new norms that are having to be entered into in the midst of that. And as a conference, we have tried to distill information, bring everybody's information together into a centralized location so that no matter where you are geographically across the body of the annual conference, you might know what resources are available and where services might be held near you. The website for that is offerhopenow.com. And we hope and pray that you will find resources there that are meaningful for you. For our part here on the podcast, part of what we're going to do is have conversations over the next 2 weeks about how our churches here in the Horizon Texas Conference are having meaningful ways of reaching their community, not only meaningful, but creative. And you'll see over these next 2 weeks, very different kinds of ways of meeting people in very different types of loss and grief. And today on the podcast, I'm so excited to have Madison Boboltz from First Arlington. You are here with us today to tell us a little bit about an event that you guys host annually now called Empty Mangers, an event aimed at meeting people in a time of grief when they have experienced infertility, miscarriage, or the loss of a child. And so thank you for being here, and I look forward to hearing so much about Empty Mangers and the work that you guys are doing at First Arlington. But as we get started today, we want to get to know you a little bit.
Of course.
And for those of you who don't know, this is dropping on Tuesday, November 19th. And like many of the rest of her commissioning class, Madison is interviewing for ordination. Our Central Texas Conference Legacy interviews are today. So we're going to pause for a minute and invite you to take 2 seconds to pray over Madison and pray over the rest of her ordination class as they have those very important and meaningful interviews, that their butterflies would fly in formation, that peace might be theirs, and that they might know that everybody in that room is there pulling for you and wanting God's best with you and for you. So know that we proclaim that 5 days in advance as we record this, but we also know and trust that God is doing amazing things in you and through you, and God will keep doing that.
Thank you. I'm very appreciative of all of the support I've gotten from lots of folks the past few weeks and few months and several years. So it's a long process here in the United Methodist Church, but excited about where it's taken me.
It is a long process in the United Methodist Church, process that's taken you from Dallas-Fort Worth to Boston and now back.
Yes. And Abilene for undergrad. So
Abilene, okay. Very good. Very
Thank
good.
you.
What we have this game that we like to play called Self on a Shelf, in which we get to know a little bit more about you by what you have brought on the shelf. Dustin hates the name, and so we keep calling it that because it makes him a little nuts. But for today, we'd love to hear a little bit more about who you are and what you brought.
Okay, I am actually, don't be misled, I'm not a crafty person. I'm not gifted in this area at all. You're going to have Carly Payne on to talk about crafting ministries.
Fair enough.
But this is actually kind of part of what we're planning this year for the Empty Mangers Retreat, because I'm very much I like to plan the words and the liturgies and the order of worship and things such as that. And I know that that's one way that people connect. But another way that people connect to faithful ministries is through embodied practices and through the arts. So we're going to have, as part of the retreat, this crafting opportunity where we have ladies from our church who have cut fabric for us and are getting ready to arrange them in star-like ornaments so that people will have something to take home with them from the retreat that's connected to this collaborative quilt-making project that will also be incorporated. So I just had this in my bag because this was the mock-up that I made with hot glue. And I took it to my crafting group and said, do better than this. Maybe you can actually use like a needle and thread instead of hot glue. And so this is my little mock-up ornament. So hopefully if you are part of the retreat, you'll see much prettier versions of those made by members of our congregation and community.
Well, but I love the fact that it's not perfect, right? Because so often we face this temptation to do everything we do with perfection.
Right.
When really what God wants from us is our authentic self to show up. And Madison is not a seamstress. And so hot glue is where you get, and that's what you got.
Yeah.
Very good. You mentioned that this is connected to the work of Empty Mangers and the Saturday-long retreat that you are having to meet people who are experiencing or have experienced at some point in their journey infertility or miscarriage or pregnancy loss or even child loss. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what Empty Mangers is, what that experience will be like, and where the idea came from and that launched you this direction?
Yes. So I have been familiar with the concept of Blue Christmas services and think that those are totally beautiful offerings for our communities, and acknowledging the kind of weight that some people are bringing with them into the holiday season and bringing various types of grief. And I had this thought one day of how the story of Christmas kind of lends itself to a particular kind of grief for people who are experiencing things such as infertility and pregnancy loss and child loss, because Advent is all about expectancy. We have the story of Elizabeth and Zachariah, who miraculously conceive. We have the story of Mary, who miraculously conceives. And so for people who are trying to conceive and haven't had that kind of miracle show up in their life and don't know if it ever will, can be difficult to engage a story where, Elizabeth was faithful, so maybe, I just need to be more faithful, and I'll kind of have that same kind of experience and journey. But a lot of people's journeys aren't as straightforward as from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where we have this miraculous introduction to Jesus with the singing angels and the starlight shining on the manger and things like that. So I think that I just kind of became more mindful of the way that we're telling the story and making space for people who are really grateful for the story of Christmas and the season of Advent, but are experiencing it very differently and maybe don't have a place to bring their story to the table. And so I'm not somebody who has experienced those things firsthand, and I had a lot of insecurity about trying to plan something for people who are. I kind of became more mindful of this because my sister is a labor and delivery nurse. I have another friend who's a PA and works in women's health. And just catching up with them, I would hear stories about how it's difficult even being a care provider and walking with people through these things and not knowing what to say or kind of how to be a meaningful presence, especially if people are trying to wrestle with where their faith is at this point, where God is in these kinds of struggles. So I kind of came from it from that direction. And then growing up on social media, social media has its setbacks, to be sure, but I think one of the real gifts is that it is a platform where more people can share their stories. And so some of these more stigmatized topics are given voice. And so I've seen posts from people my age in their 20s who probably went into trying to expand their families thinking it was going to be very straightforward and easy. And I have encountered people who have shared their stories about infertility and who, instead of getting to post the pregnancy announcement, post I'm the 1 in 4 who lost their pregnancy. And seeing kind of the way that they have, instead of isolating themselves from support, really sought it out and felt that their stories deserve space and to be honored has been really inspiring. And I think about the women in my church who are in their 80s and 90s and who have never had a chance to tell their stories like that or seek support. So it was kind of a mixture of all of those things that made me feel pretty convicted that this was a topic that the church should care about and make space for, especially in the holiday season where the story of Christmas can be kind of a tension point for people in their own experiences and journeys.
Well, and last year, you were sharing before we hit record and started going that last year the theme was aiming at how do we destigmatize this conversation, right? That was the theme of the weekend, inviting people into this conversation, recognizing that cross-generationally, we may have more or less experience of freedom and ability to talk about this, right?
Yeah.
You know, I know there are 3 years between my brother and me, and there were 2 miscarriages in between those 2, right? But mom never talked about it. There wasn't ever space to talk about it. It wasn't a part of the era, the life, the world she was largely living in that time. And so when y'all set out, last year was your first time to host Empty Mangers with the theme of, or the kind of goal of destigmatizing some of this conversation, right? To create open, safe, loving space for folks to come in their grief, whether that was really fresh or lifelong. How did y'all structure the day? How did that heart meet kind of people's lived experience that first day?
Yeah. I'll start by kind of addressing again the way that it's stigmatized. And I think that this is true for a number of different stigmatized topics, is that it's always the people who are directly impacted who kind of feel that burden of lifting the stigma. And that comes at a high emotional cost sometimes. And so there are organizations like one of the ones that we have partnered with, Gathering Hope, that is co-founded by women who have experienced this type of loss and done amazing work organizing opportunities for them to have the space to process and to seek support. And so grateful that I could reach out and partner with organizations like those who have the experience and the background and can teach and equip me how to show up in a pastoral presence. I was really transparent last year, the first time doing it, of I don't know if I am the best person to try to take something like this on, especially in my first year of ministry. And the response that I got from people who participated was how much it meant that somebody who's not necessarily directly impacted has taken the time to educate themselves and surround themselves with voices who have wisdom and insight to share. I think the spaces that they help create for people who are directly impacted and need to find community and support and healing is wonderful. And I also think that our churches need to acknowledge how the people in our pews every Sunday have experienced this kind of thing before. And they don't need to hide away to find healing and support, but it's something that we can offer in some capacity in our congregations. Even if that's just a simple acknowledgement, you know, like we do sometimes on Mother's Day services of, we know this is a really joyful day for some and a really difficult day for others. And we're here to meet you wherever you're at. So let us know how we can be in prayer for you and what kind of resources we can point you to.
Amen. And I love that you took the time, right? To seek out the wisdom of those who could help. Because sometimes pastorally, and even our lay leaders, we have a heart to do something, right? But we're tempted to skip the educate thyself, right? We can figure it out. We've got it. And yet, when we're talking about connecting with people in a spirit of radical care, doing the homework matters.
Right, yeah. I think sometimes the fear of making missteps keeps us from taking any steps at all. And so I kind of have had to remind myself too of, you know, I haven't experienced homelessness, but almost every single day in my ministry, I'm in ministry with people who are or have at some point. And that took a lot of education as well. And I still take missteps sometimes and make mistakes, use language that's not always appropriate, draw assumptions that aren't necessarily accurate. But I think the sanctifying grace that we lean on so much as United Methodists is kind of what keeps us going in terms of, you know, we haven't reached perfection, but we don't want to be forgetting people along the way on that journey towards, you know, perfecting grace.
And with God's help and with the care of the community, we can see each other's hearts enough to know that misstep wasn't a reflection of who they are, right?
Yeah.
Where this conversation meets the community I pastor week by week is we are kind of 2/3 Caucasian and 1/3 Tongan. And as a multilingual, multicultural community of faith, there's times where our Palangi community, which is the Caucasian community, you know, unintentionally says something, does something, you know, that is culturally insensitive to our Tongan community, or vice versa. right? And we have to be willing to listen well to each other, to say, where's your heart in this, right? Where was the intent behind it? Knowing that perfection is not ours, right? Now, when the bishop asks you at your ordination, are you going on to perfection? The answer is with God's help.
Yes.
Yes. You cannot say not at this rate, right?
Right.
Even though that's the narrative in your head, right? At
Right.
least it was in mine. The official correct answer is with God's help.
God's help, always. Yeah.
And I think that's and not just a thing for pastors at their ordination, but for our communities, right? With God's help.
Yes.
We're
yeah.
moving on to better and better know, love, and serve our neighbors, right? And I love that y'all took the first step last year of saying, we're going to do this, right? Even if we may not be perfect, even if it makes us anxious, even if that worry might keep us from taking that first step, we're going to take the step.
Right. Yeah.
And now you're able to take the second step this year.
Yeah. I am a very intentional person. Sometimes overthinking is, a setback, and other times it can kind of keep you from just assuming that you know exactly what a community needs. And so everything about what I planned last year was very meticulously thought out. Everything from our advertising materials, and I recruited an artist from our congregation who has experienced child loss and said, use your creative imagination to help us create an image that might connect with people. And selecting music and hymns I spent 3 days going through, what would work for a context like this, and kind of avoid some of those cliche sentiments or these guarantees of victory, and so taking the time to select music that I felt was going to be appropriate. The scripture and the sermon and everything like that was very much I read the books. I listened to the podcasts on this topic and tried to discover with the Spirit's help what are the words that this community needs to hear, and how can I be an ambassador of that. And it was really important for me too we started with an opening worship service, and this will be kind of similar to this coming retreat as well. Started with an opening worship service just to gather people in that capacity and hopefully to present some of those guidelines and alleviate some of the maybe fears or tensions that people were walking in with. And then we had lunch last year, and this was the point where I invited people, and I had invited them ahead of time so they knew to prepare, not just putting them on the spot.
Here's a microphone.
Right.
Good luck.
To prepare. If you are wanting to tell your story, again, stick with these guidelines and sharing so as to respect the others in the space. But tell us your story. Tell us what your experience with faith has been within that. Your experience with church has been with that. And those places where you have found some sort of helpful and supportive community. And that was everybody's favorite part. And that was my favorite part too, because I realized that people who have walked through these particular struggles know so much about God that those of us who haven't will never necessarily understand. Some of the books that I have read and highly recommend, because some of them are, some of them are going to be unhelpful and just, a bunch of the cliches and platitudes. But some of them dig so deep into what this kind of grief looks like and how it's experienced, and how it can be so isolating and so kind of counterintuitive to how we usually experience life. So what does it mean when my body, instead of being a vessel for life, is instead this vessel for death? And how do I heal my relationship with my body as a result of that? These are things that a lot of us never think about. And through these testimonies, I have heard the most beautiful articulations of our faith and the gospel story that I never would have experienced otherwise. And so I felt that way too, sitting here and having people tell me their stories and say things like having to leave churches because they went to their pastors for help and prayer and support and didn't get the kind that they needed. And ways that people felt like this kind of people who did go on to maybe get the family that they were hoping for, or the rainbow baby that they were praying for, still kind of struggle to meet others in that in an earlier phase of their journey with those kinds of things. And I was so enlightened, and my heart broke in some of these stories, and I was also really inspired in some of these stories of like the resilience of faith in these kinds of moments. And so that was really incredible, and just like one of the most holy hours of my life and definitely of my ministry. And I had nothing to do with it except putting people in a room together and then giving them the space to share. And I think that no matter like what kind of programming I had otherwise planned, like that's what people really need at the end of the day.
Well, I love that imagery there, right? Because so often when we find ourselves in places of deep grief, right? When we've loved and lost, what happens? People surround us, right? And yet this very specific type of loss is one that is often characterized by isolation, as you described, right?
Yeah.
If you lose grandma, everybody's coming to the funeral, and there's going to be food, and there's going to be people, and there's in that kind of community, even if it doesn't make it perfect, you're surrounded in love and care, and the loss is still very real,
right?
But you're not alone in it,
right?
But if this specific type, you've created community in a time where some are drawn to isolation in the midst of that.
Yeah. So that was really beautiful, really meaningful. And we shared food around a table, and we had people of various ages there, and like not all of their stories matched. And I think that there was like this really beautiful acceptance of that too, of like each of our experiences are our own. And this is kind of what I'm hoping to establish through our time in worship together this year, is that they're still somewhat connected. So that's kind of where this like quilting idea is coming in for this year. So
describe to us where the metaphor meets reality here with the quilting and the connections.
Great. So last year I've learned that ministry is a family business. So I asked my dad to build and construct a manger that we could use for our closing ritual last year. And so after our time together, the kind of embodied offering that we made was people could place something in the manger before taking communion. And so last year it was seed paper where people could write on it, write their prayers, write names or dates and anything meaningful to them, and offer that to the manger. And then later in the spring, we used it as a flower bed, used the manger as a flower bed to kind of symbolize love that continues to grow out of loss. And then this year, my sister has really gotten into quilting. And so I have just kind of been stirring in my mind about a way that quilting might be a component of what we do this year. And I've thought through how quilts are often gifts that we give to expectant parents for their nurseries and things like that. And they're also used to gift to people who really need something in their life to hold on to and provide comfort and protection and warmth in times of struggle. And quilts tell a story. Like there's these different fabrics that come together and kind of makes this patchwork testimony, right? And so what I've asked some people from our church to do over the past couple of weeks, and they've really come through, is to take any kind of fabric that they have lying around that they think might connect with somebody else. So we have some holiday-themed fabrics. We also have fabric you might use for a baby blanket, for a nursery quilt, and type those into 5x5 inch squares. I've learned that they are called charms. The quilting community is educating me. What people will have the opportunity to do this year is choose one of those that they feel some connection with. We'll also have some that people can write on if they choose. And then during our closing ritual, they will offer that into the manger. And then later what we'll do is we'll have a group put all of those together as a patchwork quilt, kind of showing how these different stories are connected. And we want to honor them this Advent and in Advents to come. So we're also having people cut fabric into other size pieces that can be used to make these ornaments. And that way people can offer something that will go towards this collective community project, but they'll also have something that they can take with them to remember on their own tree or wherever they choose to place it. So
keep them grounded to the experience that they've had. For those, our audience here on Pod Strangely Warmed is largely good Methodist pastors and lay leaders, and growing across the Horizon Texas Conference. For folks who know somebody who could really benefit from this, what's date, time, what's registration look like, and then just start there.
Great. Okay, so we will be gathering at 2 p.m. on December 1st. It's a Sunday afternoon. So we're starting right at the start of Advent, and hopefully when people will kind of be coming back into town from their Thanksgiving trips. And we are at First United Methodist Church of Arlington, 313 North Center Street. You can register online on our church website, firstumcarlington.org, or you can find us on Facebook or Instagram and find ways of registering there as well. And we'll start worship at 2:15 after people have had a chance to come in and check in. And then at 3 o'clock, we'll kind of have that community storytelling session. And then I'm really excited this year because we're going to be able to offer workshops.
Oh, very good.
So Peyton Lauderdale from the organization Gathering Hope is coming to lead a workshop that she's led with her organization before, where you can craft a Christmas decoration in remembrance of your baby. And so she'll be offering that. And we're also going to have someone from the organization A Memory Grows, which is run by DeAndrea Dare, who has United Methodist connections. And they're going to do more of a grief awareness workshop because we don't want to limit this, again, to people who are the ones necessarily going through it right now or have gone through it. We also want it to be available for people like my sister, who works in labor and delivery and who wants more awareness on this issue and how she can show up in a meaningful way. Or to our fellow pastors who maybe feel convicted that this is a conversation they want to become more educated on, and how can they be mindful of this in their own communities and congregations. That'll be kind of more of just a awareness workshop for those who are looking for ways that they can be supportive. Then we'll move from there to dinner, and then our closing worship ritual, which will be a little bit shorter, where we'll do the offering to the manger and then also close out by sharing Holy Communion.
Very good. That sounds like a really meaningful and important time together.
Yeah.
I found it on the website. It's on the events tab. Make sure you click through. You can register. Also, if you're a church leader who may or may not be geographically able to attend, or to encourage some specific folks within your congregation who might want to attend, you've put together an incredibly helpful FAQ document, which is intended to be read by just a participant in the day.
Yes.
But it also gives us a window into the intentionality and thoughtfulness. You claimed the headspace of an overthinker earlier in the podcast. And when I read that Google Doc earlier today, I'm like, Madison's got every little bit of this covered.
Well, one of the comments we received last year was someone said, we gathered after the opening worship service that I had planned and preached in, and she said, I just kept waiting for you to say something that was going to sting. And I just kind of, because that's what I've come to expect, is that like my faith leaders just don't understand, or they're going to let me down, or like this isn't going to be what I actually need. And so she was like, I can't believe I made it through a whole hour where she felt like someone had cared enough to do that. So I do kind of like I have an exhaustive FAQ document, but it's so that people who don't necessarily have to go in wondering those, and with carrying some of those kinds of fears, but can know exactly what to expect, know if they want to maybe show up for one part of it and leave for another. Everything is very invitational, and kind of have that kind of grounded sense going in about what exactly to expect. So
you mentioned the participant who said, I was just waiting for you to say something that stings. I think one reality when we talk about these conversations, whether it's specific to infertility and child loss and miscarriage, or other stigmatized conversations within the life of the church, sometimes good and faithful, well-intentioned people end up saying stuff that stings, that causes hurt, harm, and trouble. And as United Methodists, whose 3 simple rules begin with do no harm, right? We ultimately get to doing good and loving God, right? But we begin in a place of do no harm. At the bottom of your FAQ document, you've got community guidelines for conversation, right? Some ways to avoid sticking your foot in your mouth or unintentionally causing harm to your neighbor.
We're not going to offer unsolicited advice. We're not going to try to tie everything up in a theological bow. We're just creating space where people can wrestle with God if that's what they need to do. Yeah.
Very good. If you were to say to folks as they were leaving this podcast conversation, looking at not just what are you doing at First Arlington, but also considering as they look in their neighborhood and in their community for where is God's heart breaking that we might come alongside. You described for us at the very beginning of this podcast kind of how Empty Mangers came into being. What invitation would you give to pastors, church leaders, and our broader Methodist community as they consider, if not for this year, because we're kind of late in the planning process for something blue Christmassy, meeting people in the midst of their grief in the face of the holidays. What invitation would you give them as they're considering Advent 2025?
Yeah. We're hoping to do this again. And so if there's any ways, I really feel like this isn't meant to be just like a First UMC Arlington thing. I think from the conversations I've had, there's actually a bit of kind of Holy Spirit energy at work from other pastors and churches who feel like this might be something they want to address and offer in their congregations. And so I think that how cool would it be if we as a conference kind of gain the reputation of being a conference that really cares about this. So maybe this church is offering this during Advent, and this other church is going to offer this during Mother's Day or Father's Day, and this other church is going to do something in October for like Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month. So kind of like let's collaborate so that it's not even necessarily just an Advent thing, but it's something that all of us as we're seeking to maximize care and healing can say to members of our congregation, we know that this is coming up, or we know that this pastor has experience in this, or we know that this is an opportunity where you might find connection. And then I would also say I cannot recommend the podcast Out of Gathering Hope highly enough. That's been where I've looked to for the inspiration, and I've been so educated. And so that podcast is called the Sucky Sisterhood Podcast. It was recently called Slaying the Stigma. And it is so fantastic. I think that it's not necessarily, UMC theology, but I would say that my experience listening to it is that it's been very theologically grounded and mindful. And so I would really encourage pastors to seek out those kinds of voices and resources for themselves, just so that they can learn about what kind of language to use for people, what kind of support to offer, and also connect to Jesus and connect to God in a new way through these testimonies and through these stories. It's really impacted the way that I even engage in my faith. So check out those resources.
Very good. Madison, thank you so much for being here, not only to share with us the profound ministry that's going to happen through Empty Mangers and that has already happened, but also in like the 4 days before ordination interviews. Thank you for being here. Know that we are praying with you on Tuesday and the rest of the ordination classes they interview as well. If you want to know more about how to connect in ministry during this holiday season with communities that are experiencing grief and loss, regardless of its form, we encourage you once again to go to offerhopenow.com and seek out churches across the Horizon Texas Conference that are intentionally gathering together to meet their neighbors in a spirit of love, a spirit of compassion, and a spirit that honors Christ. Until next time, I'm Daniel Hawkins, and this is Pod Strangely Warmed. This has been Pod Strangely Warmed. If you enjoyed our conversation today, know that you can find us anywhere you find podcasts. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, any and all the places, we are there. So if you want to continue the good United Methodist conversation that you've been a part of today, find us, like us, rate us, review us, and share with a friend so that the good news that is happening right here in our own midst can amplify even more. As you're watching this, Madison is interviewing with the Board of Ordained Ministry.
That's true. Pray for me.
Also our 80th episode.
80th. All right. We are octogenarians, woohoo, which means we are Methodist. Don't cut that and put that at the end.